We can classify neurons based on their structure or based on their function. So in the structural classification of neurons, we're going to classify neurons based on the number of cellular processes they have. So the structural classification is really defining the number of cellular processes they have. So how many dendrites and axons do they have? So first we'll look at unipolar neurons. So unipolar neurons are really going to have a single process or a single axon. So unipolar neurons are going to have this long axon with a cell body at the center. One side of the axon is going to have an axon terminal. The other side of the axon is actually going to have this specialized region called receptive endings. These receptive endings are going to be associated then with receptors so that the receptive endings can receive that sensory information from those receptors. So in a unipolar neuron, there's really only a single cellular process, and that's the axon. So we've got a cell body, and then we've got an axon, but that axon has two different regions. It's got this kind of peripheral region where it's going to have these receptive endings that might be interacting with a receptor, so receiving sensory information from a receptor. They'd then send that sensory information down the peripheral process of the axon and then down into the central process of the axon, which will ultimately end in a normal axon terminal. So unipolar neurons have a single cellular process, it's an axon. Unipolar neurons are the majority of our sensory or our afferent neurons. So most of our sensory or our afferent neurons that are receiving sensory information from receptors and communicating that information to the central nervous system are going to be unipolar. The second type of neuron could be a bipolar neuron. A bipolar neuron is going to have two cellular processes. It's going to have an axon and it's going to have a dendrite, and those are going to extend out from opposite sides of the cell body. So bipolar neurons have two cellular processes. They've got a dendrite and they've got an axon. The dendrite and the axon are extending out on opposite sides of the cell body. Bipolar neurons are extremely rare. They're found in some of our special sensory organs. So for example, in our olfactory mucosa, so that would then be in your nose, as well as in your eye, so in the retina, and actually you can find some in the ear as well. So bipolar neurons are definitely the most rare. They're only found in some of our sensory organs, so in our nose, our eyes, and our ears. Lastly, we have multipolar neurons. Multipolar neurons have three or more processes. They're going to have a single axon, but then they can have multiple dendrites. So multipolar neurons have a single axon and multiple dendrites. So they have three or more processes. Multipolar neurons are going to be the major type of neuron in the central nervous system. They're also just in general the most common type of neuron in humans. Almost 99% of the neurons in our bodies are actually going to be multipolar. The majority of our motor neurons or our efferent neurons are actually going to be multipolar neurons. So our sensory or our afferent neurons are mostly unipolar, whereas our motor neurons or our efferent neurons are mostly multipolar. So that leads us into the functional classification of neurons. So we can classify neurons based on their function. So neurons could be considered sensory or afferent neurons if they're carrying information towards the central nervous system or towards the brain and the spinal cord. So they're transmitting impulses from those sensory receptors toward the CNS, so toward those integration centers. Efferent or motor neurons are then carrying impulses away from the central nervous system. They're carrying that information from the central nervous system to those effector organs, so our muscles and our glands. So our motor neurons or our efferent neurons are always carrying motor output away from the central nervous system and towards our effector organs. Lastly, we could classify neurons as interneurons. Interneurons are also known as association neurons. These association neurons or interneurons are going to lie in between our sensory and our motor neurons, and they're going to shuttle signals in between those sensory and motor neurons. So they're communicating in between sensory and motor neurons. So our functional classifications are dictated based on if that neuron's carrying information towards the central nervous system or away from the central nervous system, or if they're carrying information completely within that central nervous system. So sensory or afferent neurons are carrying sensory information to the central nervous system. Sensory neurons or afferent neurons are typically unipolar neurons. Efferent or motor neurons are then going to be carrying information away from the central nervous system and towards those effector organs. And our efferent and motor neurons are typically multipolar neurons. Lastly, we have interneurons or association neurons. Interneurons are communicating in between those sensory and those motor neurons.